Live.
I'm still looking. Like,
we met the
what
requisite
the
number
hell?
of wells, so we can begin. We now have 9. Well.
What? Are they chatting?
Yeah, they're chatting. What do you think I've been talking about?
Also, I need to say ground floor because that's my requirement when I'm on time for the show.
Yeah. Well, okay.
Ooh, and
good.
we got a wello.
Good. Oh, my. All right.
Oh, it's Patrick, right? Hi, Patrick.
Oh, Patrick. Patrick, we're a big fan of.
Yeah,
Patrick.
Just about Patrick.
Patrick is the only one of you that's been in my dreams. I mentioned that. Maybe you weren't in the chat that day, but yeah.
It's quite possible, yeah. I've missed a few things, right?
I-
Because
Yeah.
of traveling.
I'm a little miffed that I haven't been in your dreams.
Oh. All right.
Who are you again?
I think I'm just sitting here. I don't know.
By the way, I'm just going to show this to you because I thought this was hilarious. My friend made this. We were done eating and he just made that.
Well, now you have to
Thought it was hilarious.
You have
That
to
was-
share
that
it
was
on
Ken.
Discord.
You're right. You're right. I do. Hold on. I'll copy that and then I'll send it on Discord.
Okay, Jonathan thinks they had a LangTime dream last night,
I'm not
but
finding
can't
it.
remember the details. So what we need to do is everyone needs to fill in Jonathan's dream details here in chat, so that way Jonathan remembers. And of course, whatever details are submitted must be true. And so
Okay. So
that's
it was Jonathan is there in their family home, one that they grew up in, but it looks slightly different. And Jonathan's mother is there, but it's actually a person that they don't recognize. And for some reason, LangTime is happening, and it's like a live broadcast in the kitchen. And the thing is, I am there, right? And I'm saying that isn't the right coffee. And I keep going to everybody saying, look, this isn't the right coffee. And Jonathan perceives that I'm very, very angry at them because the right coffee isn't there. Meantime, Jesse is actually seated and filing through
Trans-Siberian Orchestra songs.
No, I was going to say airline certificates.
Oh, I was working in Miles's detail.
Nice. No, just airline certificates. And you're being really fascinated by this and trying to get my attention, and I'm just so upset that the coffee is wrong. And you're like, look at this. They have all of them, even the ones from last year. And you're just going through these airline certificates and just...
What are airline certificates, babe?
It's just something that was real in the dream. That made sense in the dream. It doesn't make sense in real life, of course.
Okay.
Of course.
Anyway, and
you
then...
know what the true nightmare is?
Yeah.
The LTS episode started on time.
Oh my God! And then it happened.
Oh, man.
Man.
I'm realizing that
I'm gonna sneeze.
not wearing my glasses.
Hell yeah.
There we go.
Is that's a
The
bingo-
echo of the
Is that a
instruments.
bingo item? Jesse sneezing? feel like
I
it's-
think it's David, isn't it?
Oh,
That
I
was
feel
a-
like it's you.
That was a really good high five. I just watched the replay. It was fantastic.
And with my left at that.
Yeah, no, that
So
was
there you go.
great. That was great.
Oh, they want a Vincent scream.
Yeah, we'll get it. All right, so
Oh, Vincent's over there. Also, do you want your glasses?
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And
Yeah.
and in
I
case anyone
do.
doesn't know, this is Matthijs.
Yes,
Hi.
and I want everybody to acknowledge just how clever the title of this episode is. Did you happen to see it?
Oh, I did. Yeah, no, I was.
Yeah,
I was reasonably offended by
Is
it.
it?
Twice as Thijs. Twice as Thijs.
Well, also like I don't go by Thijs. That's also a Dutch name. You know,
What?
it's like as a short form of Matthijs, Thijs.
Really?
And I don't use it. Yeah, because it's a different. To me, it's a different name.
That's what you get, David.
I had no idea.
Yeah, actually, the short form in the Netherlands for Matthijs is Thijs, not Matt.
Why?
That I have no answer to. I mean, there is no Y there. It's just that is how it is.
There isn't a Y. It's an IJ.
It's an
but-
IJ,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, with two dots over it. So it's a Y, but
But not that Y.
with two dots over it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway.
You could have just called it Twijs Matthijs.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You could have, couldn't you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, you know, water under the bridge, you know.
Yeah. Welcome to George Corley of the Conlangery podcast. There will be a Tongues and Runes episode. It feels like it should be Runes and Tongues, doesn't it?
Well, this is like the thing in, you know, the Rihanna S&M song, right? And if I remember right, she says chains and whips excite me, and I always feel like it's whips. It should be whips and chains. That is so much more of a logical order. Every
I
time
think
she
so,
does
I
that,
agree.
I feel tripped up by it. It's like this is the wrong.
The
Yeah.
id before the a.
And which song, which artist is this?
Rihanna.
S&M, you know,
Who?
Rihanna.
Can you spell this name, please?
Isn't it Rihanna? Rihanna?
Yeah,
Oh, Rihanna.
yeah,
What were you saying?
Rihanna.
Rihaga?
I don't hear a G.
This is what I'm hearing. I'm hearing Rihaga.
Yeah, well, yeah, you hear Agmas everywhere. Remember this? We've been over this. You think all my ends are ngs.
Yeah. Oh, hey, I thought you said cheese and whips. Yeah.
I
Cheese and
mean,
whips.
both of those do excite me.
Yeah.
That is a fair point.
Cheese and
Although
whips.
I'm actually not that wild about cheese.
Yeah,
For a
and
Dutchman, I guess.
Get ready. I'm about to blow your mind. Cheese whips.
Is that a thing?
I
Will
think
be
so.
now.
I think so. Isn't it?
I think whipped
It
made out of
sounds
cheese,
real.
or like
Yeah.
whipped
Perhaps.
cheese, like whipped cream.
Do you know
but
like the string cheese and you can tear off a
Oh, it's
little
a-
string and then you can do this with it.
No, it's
Yeah,
a
it was-
party.
And it's a cheese whip.
It's a party. You invite somebody. Hey, we're having a cheese whip. Come on down. Bring any cheese you want. Right? Is this the thing that happened in your
Alright.
neck of the woods?
No.
You didn't have cheese whips?
No.
It's like
Where
a-
you were?
like a village fete, but with cheese.
Were they called cheese nannies? Moo daddies?
You're not allowed here anymore.
See, ragdoll is already confirming my pronunciation.
Rihaga?
Rihanna.
Rihaga.
There's no good in there. I don't know.
Rihaga. It sounds like you're trying to affect what's his name? Humphrey Bogart.
That assumes I know stuff about films. So
Sorry, buddy. We're going to see Rihanna.
I'll take your word for it.
Please, Rick, you have to bring me with you. Sorry, pal. I only got one ticket. Please, Rick, and so on.
Yeah, those are those are references for sure.
Logan is in real time for the next 24 minutes.
And then ceases to be real time.
So that
disappears from the space time.
We need to make these 24 minutes
that's a
count.
Pokemon Legend Arceus's entire day.
It's 24 minutes.
Yeah, because it's a minute an hour. Yeah. All right. So I figured since I forgot to extend the life of the poll, we should probably just tell people what the poll results were.
Oh, I guess so.
Just because it's actually a very simple thing anyway. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to pull up this thing. I'm going to change the view. We're going to go back to basic.
Patrick, is it really your birthday?
Who?
Patrick.
Oh, is it?
If so, happy birthday.
Happy birthday, Patrick.
Do we have a patron named Patrick? Like Patrick Dempsey?
Rude.
All right, so
Ooh, it really is Patrick's birthday.
it's Patrick's birthday.
And that's, of course, why
It's
we have a
Patrick's
special
birthday.
episode.
Yeah, we
course.
To celebrate Patrick,
me,
we
of
brought
course.
Matthijs on stream.
yeah, we brought Matthijs just for you, Patrick.
To be fair, you still haven't paid me the commission for introducing Patrick to the show, so like this seems a good opportunity to do it.
Was it you that introduced Patrick?
Yes, it was.
Really?
Yes, it was. Patrick's an old friend of mine.
You know who Patrick is?
I do.
They know who you are.
Well, I mean that's an arguable point. I don't think anybody really knows who I am. So.
Matthijs is the reason Patrick came to Copicon.
Oh, all right. Let's put a pin in this then because I want to revisit this. All right. So first, our poll, this is a very simple one. I just want to get it out of the way. The idea was if we were going to have an independent category of adjectives or if we were going to say that adjectives were basically nouns. And so this was kind of like Haupuff. We actually, in Haupuff, like, we didn't have adjectives. We had, the strong one was the thing. And honestly, it was not close. It was not close. Everybody wanted independent adjectives. So just ripping that Band-Aid off, we're going to have independent adjectives in...
To be fair, that is what I would have voted if I had voted in the poll. So that seems fair.
You're not setting a very good example. I'm just going to lay that out there. You're
fair.
setting a terrible example.
That's often the case.
Yeah,
so,
I know.
Yeah.
Anyway, but...
Story of my life.
Yeah, so when we pick back up next week, that's what we're going to do. We're going to have adjectives, and that'll be it. Anyway, so now I'm gonna go back to split screen view. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
And then I'm going to, well, actually, I guess I can leave that up, can't I? So,
Yeah, 'cause-
so I mean, if you're like me, and I don't know if you are like me, Matthijs, but
That seems dubious.
I really love looking at myself.
Oh yeah, I mean that's a given, right?
So-
I mean you've seen me.
This is
Yeah.
this is why David and I get along so well. We both like looking at him.
That's a good one.
Yeah.
I like it.
Everybody knows that it's actually me that's the eye candy for LTS, right?
We do know that, yes.
Anyway, all
I
right.
hope people can recognize I'm wearing the LTS shirt.
Yay!
Important to point that out.
Yeah, and it's also important to point out that neither Jesse nor I has one.
Yeah, because you can't get your shit together, so
No.
makes sense.
I can't get my shirt together.
or that.
Yeah,
We haven't yet patronized ourselves.
yeah.
Despite all the patronizing that David does.
It's
like,
not enough. It's not enough.
You'll have to tell Jake that there has to be more of that.
You can say, type of thing. I need to work on that patronization. So it's like somebody shows me a con, it's like, oh, you were finished.
Exactly right. It's like
I thought these were
that's a
just.
nice attempt, that you made.
I thought these were just your notes. I mean, goodness gracious, it's like, I'm sorry, I thought you were sending me a conlang, not a spreadsheet.
That is a sound change you could make. Yes.
Yeah, it's probably something that exists.
Listen, anything can happen in language.
That's true. Anything, even this garbage. Anyway, so. All right, so this is now what I want to know. In honor of Patrick's birthday, tell us about the origin story of Twijs.
Oh, okay. I see what you were doing here.
Per-
We're
you-
doing the slash fic sort
You
of approach.
prefer that over Matrick, I assume.
Actually, Matrix sounds a bit like the Matrix, right? I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Oh man! Oh, if you guys got an apartment together, you could call it the Matrix.
We could. I mean, that would have to be the Wi-Fi name, right? So yeah, what's the origin story? Well, it's kind of a funny origin story that's a little bit long and stupid, but essentially,
Okay.
we were on an internet forum together with a lot of other people that we know,
Okay.
and then eventually a bunch of us split off and created a sort of little secret internet forum, which is just for us friends, where we would post. This was in the pre-Discord days, right? So it's basically the equivalent of like having a Discord together, except there wasn't a Discord. So we had a board, which still exists actually, and it has like a bunch of threads, and everybody's just like the whole time posting it, and we all know each other from years and years and years, etc., etc. And and Patrick and I were both in this group. That's essentially the long and short of it. And because we have known each other for ages and ages, we actually know quite a lot about each other. And you become friends with these people, or rather, we're there because we're already friends. And I knew that Patrick is really into Klingon, and sort of also the whole setting and world building and stuff, but also certainly
Wow.
the linguistic aspect of Star Trek. And so I mentioned this whole thing going on, and that Mark Okrand was going to be there, and so forth. And since he lives in the area, I was like, "Hey, do you want to come along?" And he was very interested. So.
Wow. Was Patrick aware previously that Mark Okrand lived in the DC area as well?
No, because I didn't know that, and I don't. At least you have to ask him what he knows, but I don't imagine so.
I'm gonna give you a bit of a secret. Basically, if you're into the theater scene in DC, that's where you might run into Mark Okrand. Yeah. Apparently, they have a thriving kind of theater life there. Just like in New York City or in London. Apparently. Anyway.
So to fill you in, no, Patrick did not know that Mark lived in the area. And Danielle just informed all of us that a glitch in the Matrix was a phrase first spoken by Reginald Barclay.
How fitting.
Oh,
That's
wow.
amazing.
Huh, man. I think that the IPA are frequently in Chicago. Is that right?
Maybe.
Oh, this is like the convention? Or?
Yeah, the Klingon convention. I think they're frequently in Chicago, and I know
That might
that
be why he thinks that. Yeah.
there was a simultaneous IPA when there was the World Science Fiction Convention in Chicago. It was a simultaneous thing, and so like there was some reciprocity when that happened. That, by the way, that was the convention where I met Nina Post in Chicago. Yeah.
Nina?
We'll talk about this later, Nina.
Okay.
Anyway,
I think the only time I've been to Chicago was for International Mr. Leather. That's a while ago now.
wow, international, so not just a regional.
No, this is like a big global event. It's like one of the big fetish events like in the world. It's like International Mr. Leather. I think it's always in Chicago every year. I will probably be going again next year.
Yeah, often in Chicago or Indianapolis.
Indianapolis is.
Why would anything be in
Yeah.
Indianapolis?
It's honestly, it's
Absolutely no
the
reason.
central location. It is a place where a lot of conventions end up being held for a lot of things just
I guess
because
just
of
the
location.
geography kind
Yeah.
of thing.
I've heard it's a lot of.
Well,
it's
that's
a
right,
place where a
actually,
lot of people don't want to go for any reason.
That's like Critical Role did one of their things in Indianapolis. I think it was their first live show or something. So that would actually make sense. Yeah.
Oh. All right. So, okay.
The first time I went there was for a coaches convention. Indianapolis.
Yeah. So, incidentally, there is the history you mentioned. There's a similar. Well, there's two similar histories in the conlanging community. Of course, that was how the conlang list started. Was a splinter group from the Usenet. It was also, though, when I was on the conlang list. And I was partly responsible for this. Essentially, there were people on the conlang list who felt that some of the newer members were annoying and too brash and were not serious about conlanging. It was. And so they created a secret conlang list just for, that was invite only.
Guard or whatever.
It was invite only to keep the riffraff out.
Wait, are we saying you're the riffraff or you
I
were
was the
judging?
riffraff.
Oh, you were the riffraff.
I was the
Okay,
riffraff.
So
okay.
this is the reverse where like
Yeah.
I was the non-riffraff and we have this invite-only forum where Patrick and I go there.
Yeah. And so that was LangDev. LangDev.
Oh yeah, Patrick makes a good point that technically Mark Ockerton being announced as a speaker. That's true. I did also mention to Patrick in general that it was happening and that he might be interested in it, but I think the Mark Ockerton thing was sort of a cherry on top kind of aspect. Yeah.
Oh, that's really nice. Yeah.
Like Jonathan's point. That makes sense. It does, doesn't it?
I have a bit of a serrated edge to my personality, I think.
Like a good bread knife, that's you.
You?
Yeah.
You?
Yeah, I know.
What?
And sometimes I'm a better version of myself and sometimes I'm not.
Well, you can't always be a better version of yourself because then that would be yourself, right? So
That is very true, Matthijs. So at some point, if you're going to have a better version of yourself, you have to be a lesser.
right, there's a law of averages, right?
Yeah, man. I really have to say I really admire people like Mr. Rogers, who evidently can always be the best version of themselves, and so it is indeed just themselves. I can't do it. And it's not even like, Bob Ross apparently had kind of a cathartic life change and became the best version of himself. I can't even do that. I can't promise that. I can't promise right now that I'm going to be the best version of myself moving forward. It's just not going to happen. Very sorry. Evidently, I'm gonna rile everybody's feathers at some point, including the people to my left and right. They're going to be upset at me before the day is out for some reason, but I'll make it up to y'all.
It's okay. As long as you buy me dinner, it's all good.
You like these donuts?
I paid for that, got you.
Oh, man.
We can reimburse you if you just invoice. If you invoice
triplicate.
LangTime
Yeah,
Studio
yeah.
Incorporated.
But it has to have the stamp from the CEO, right? I mean,
Yeah,
he has to sign off on
it does,
actually,
and
yeah.
we will not pay for that postage, so you have to mail it and then
To the lighthouse.
Yeah, and then they'll mail it back. All of this stuff actually comes out of the reimbursement.
I
So
understand, yeah.
at a certain point in time, like it's probably going to come out to like 12 cents, I think, probably, and then there's the conversion.
I
So.
mean, nowadays in Europe, that's a good amount of money, so
That's true, not like here.
given how our economy is doing.
Yeah.
I will say Patrick mentions all you have to do is adjust the upper bounds on your definitions, and then this is your best self. And also, don't feel bad about going for Mark Okra. I mean, there is a reason we chose the lineup of speakers that we did, and
Yeah.
you could have 100% been there for Mark, and we would be delighted that you came.
Of course, yeah, right.
Because Mark is amazing.
The
And
pull factor was intended, I assume.
oh, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Which is also, we assume there were people who were there 100% to meet Bibloridian, and we know that. And we were very happy to be able to save his announcement till the very final announcement to get more people to come.
It's also, yeah, and I know that I remarked upon it there, but it's also a really wild thing that we have, because of things like YouTube and streaming, they're essentially parallel realities. So indeed, there were people that were there exclusively for Bibloridian, and then there were people there who were like, who is this?
Yeah, you have this whole explanation also, right? Because you have to
Yeah.
introduce the channel and everything. Because but that's the case with all of this. Because there's like these mega YouTubers who have like millions of followers and whatever. And I have never heard of any of them.
Yeah.
No idea who these people are. But like to a lot of other people, that's like a huge name. You know, that's just how our society works now.
And that is, I have to say, it's a real shame, because that was one of the coolest things about the early conlang community, was that finally everybody was like getting together and seeing each other's stuff and learning from it, and everybody who knew who everybody was. And then suddenly at one point that was just no longer the case. And nothing has really replaced that. I mentioned this before, I see hope for the future with Discord. I just wonder, where's the next step? What's the next thing that's going to happen?
Because Discord is also, to some extent, I mean, if you look at sort of the platform internet that we've had for the last 10 years or whatever, like compared to that, you know, everybody's moving to Discord for good reasons because they want to get away from the platform control and all this kind of stuff. But it does actually, in a way, also contribute to the splintering, right? Because everybody has their own little Discord channel. You know, you don't know that they exist. There is no findability of any kind. There's no way of knowing essentially where these are if you're not invited to them. There's no way to get in.
Yes.
Right? And so, like, essentially, this is sort of like everything is sort of centrifugal again in that way. And I think for the purposes that you're talking about, this is not necessarily a good development.
It's
you know, and actually, right as you were saying that, Jonathan typed the exact same thing. That
Yeah,
it's,
exactly.
It's so fragmentary. Yeah.
That's the thing.
I would say the one benefit is that for better or worse, it's a form of gatekeeping, right? It's like this is going to be my community, and, you know, one or two people or however many are in charge of the Discord, and we decide who gets in, right? But then, if you're in there, then you learn about those people in a way that you don't when we were basically just exclusively Twitter, Facebook, you know, Reddit, things like that. And so
it's more intense. It's more ongoing. Yeah, no, that's true.
That's better. But yeah, the problem that everybody's mentioned is valid. Yeah.
Well, and also Logan is mentioning you keep them private to keep out the riffraff.
Yeah, I know.
Which is not bad either, because, you know, I will know anything that's online needs a certain amount of selection and moderation and so forth anyway, right? That's not all a bad thing.
Yeah, that was actually my problem. There were, because Logan mentioned there are way too many disconnected conlang discords. This is true, but there's also two different types, and it's basically those with strong moderation and those without, because basically those without are indistinguishable from one another. It's like I've been on at least 4 of them. And they have well over 100 channels. All of the channels are named based on usually in-jokes or memes. And the discussion in each one of those channels is indistinguishable from every other channel. It's just random.
That always tends to happen. I mean, we already have this, right? Where like we have
jokes.
We have a chat and we have Conlang Corner and we have the quotes and memes, and, you know, eventually our sort of conversation with our 20, 30 people just goes over all of them, you know.
Yeah.
This is true, but then, like, you know, the strong moderation that Jesse and I have, you know, where we put you in timeout and we say absolutely this is out of discussion. This sentence had the word morpheme, that's why we're deleting it and banning you and things like that.
Yeah.
Correct.
Completely banned.
Yeah,
Of course.
completely and totally irrevocably
already,
banned. Oh, that's right. I was supposed to post that picture on the
on the Discord.
Yeah. So I'll go ahead and do that. But I'm going to carefully decide which channel this should be in. And you know what? This is more of a meme thing, so I'm going to put it in quotes and memes because that's where this type of discussion belongs.
Yeah, exactly right.
And what was funny is when we did our initial draw up of what channels we would have, there were not that many, and it's really grown out of Oh, people are sharing this. Let's try to move it to a different channel so it doesn't block up this other thing.
Well, you have to be careful with that, right? Because
didn't remember.
you get
Yeah.
if you have too much channel splintering, also then they all dry up
Yeah,
too much.
yeah,
So
yeah.
there is actually a sort of optimum point there.
Yeah.
I don't remember what the photo was. It didn't remember my. I tried to paste it and it didn't work.
Or the
So it
the goofy food thing.
Yeah.
With,
Oh, that's right. That
could
well,
also go in nudity as well.
it was. Oh gosh.
Although I think I invented the idea that was about food. I don't think it originally was, right?
No. Nudlities was the.
It actually was not necessarily about food.
Yeah.
It
was-
became about food because
yeah.
that's what people posted
I think
there. And I
started
think it was
posting-
you
yeah, I
just
think I
like
started
putting
posting
food.
pictures there because it was the
I think we had
pandemic, right?
just named it that because we had, come
Well-
up with a name for our Nulitis, the rabbit gathering. And so we kind of named it that. I don't know that it ever started as a food
No, I
channel.
mean, it has a little coffee icon, right? So
It-
it's not
so
So-
I thought it was a
so
coffee
here's the-
clutch kind of thing.
right.
Here's the
right.
thing: the meaning of Nulitis, right? That was the very first great big potluck, right, of the cold season for the rabbits. And so when I think you named the channel, you had the idea about the community surrounding that
Yeah.
food-based event, and then it just kind of got replaced by the food. rather
Which
than-
I am not
Yeah.
complaining about.
Yeah, that was a really positive.
Also,
change.
Patrick, that's an excellent White Wolf RPG. You should totally play that.
What's that?
Rabbit the Gathering.
Oh, yeah.
There it is. Oh, man.
That would actually be really cool. Like it has like the seriousness of artwork and theme of Magic the Gathering, except rather than fighting, all these rabbits are just putting together a group feast.
And then it turns into a Secret of Nim or something.
Man,
And we're just going to watch you search your photos again, aren't we?
I'm
This
trying
is
to.
really excellent content.
find
This is
it.
what the people logging for is to
Do you
watch
think you
David
could search for food
stare
art?
downwards. Let's all stare
Oh,
downwards.
I'm just so sad. Like that was.
This
It was going to be
Moment
so
of silence.
funny.
I can't believe you didn't just. It was somewhere around all the pictures of Natalie that you kept showing, Matthijs. Look,
So-
they think it's me. Do you think it was tagged David? They thought that was David.
No, that can't be the
Hello?
case. That can't be the
Hey,
case.
Carl, and
Carl
also
Buck is
hello,
also here.
Kiete.
Carl.
Only I have to what takes to
I'm a fan of Carl.
Save this stream or save. I
Save.
guess. Yeah, get that shirt off. I mean,
Yeah.
be careful what you wish for, because I will do it.
Right. I did want to mention for those who know George, who has the Conlangery podcast. Most recent episode was an interview with Carl Buck, where he was talking about, among other things, our work on Halo, the Sangheili language. Almost everything he said was factually correct. So
Wow,
yeah,
that's a high score.
yeah, it is. It was like honestly, it was like 92%. It's pretty good.
It's passing grade even for David.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man.
So many times I wonder what you say about me when I'm not here.
Incidentally, though, this is what I looked like when I was 16.
That's very androgynous.
Seriously?
I think so.
I don't think so.
I'm telling you, he gets misgendered a lot.
Well, I do, but it's not like they're like, oh, who is this person whose gender I can't figure out? It's like, oh, here's this woman. Hi, ma'am. That happens a lot. That happens a lot.
Or like we get greeted as how are you two ladies doing?
See, I usually like it when this happens, right? But
Yeah.
I think David's fine with it.
Yeah.
okay, that's good.
Yeah, I'm good with that.
And I'm like, he's so pretty, it's okay.
Right,
That's the thing. It's really a compliment. Let's be honest.
yeah. Okay, now I'm not going to find it. I'm not going to find it. Oh, that makes me sad.
Yeah, Magpie goes to score.
Oh.
And thank
Hold
you,
on.
Patrick. That's good to know. What is David? What about magpies? Magpipes?
Magpipes. Magpie, you could play the magpipes.
What?
See?
What? Where were we talking about instruments? Were we talking about
No,
what?
I mean we're half an hour in and the dad jokes are already coming out, so
I
it's
thought
not
it
a good
was-
sign.
I thought it was great.
Oh my gosh.
Let's get to the topic of our episode.
Oh, that's right. Actually, no, just one more thing
Okay.
beforehand. I want to mention this. I forget if I mentioned this on stream, but there was I was once giving a talk at Jesse's University. This was shortly after the dress thing, the white and gold dress versus blue and black.
Oh, right.
Okay.
Yes.
And I put up an image of the dark elves and who they're kind of like dress.
As in, the
their garb.
drow, like the classic, whatever, Forgotten Realms
Well,
ones, or...
no, the Dark Elves from Thor: The Dark World, and they had like these
okay.
kind of like gold masks and kind of a black thing going, and with some white accents. And I said, and here are the Dark Elves, wearing their blue and black, as just as a joke, and some people laughed, and immediately after I said that, 2 people got up and walked out. I'd been talking for a bit too. I was like, it may have been a
Was that
coincidence,
too
but
much?
I was
This
like,
is the effect you have on every audience.
yeah. So actually, here is.
Also, hi, Jake.
Oh, Jake.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's always my reaction. Anyway, so I actually had. That's so difficult, Jake, because like most of the time you just want to be yourself, but sometimes it's like you're going to meet with some people and somebody whispers and you have to be really sad when you talk to these people, and you're like, all right, I have to interact with people sadly.
I'm gonna go back to my work here.
Oh man! All right. Okay, but I did have a question. So, Matthijs, as many of you don't know, your academic background is.
Well, it's actually 2 things.
Okay.
As in, I have and this is not me boasting, we're just being practical. I have a bachelor's in philosophy, and I did my master's and my PhD in economic history. And then I've also done a postdoc research job thing in economic anthropology, which is a somewhat related field. But mostly I do sort of economic stuff, but at the more abstract level, or I used to do that. Yeah.
Yeah. So often when people are developing fantasy settings, and it doesn't matter for whether this is a movie, a book, or a game or whatever, you will find they go into great detail about aspects of that society that interest them, and no detail in the things that don't. So, for example, in discussing the various LangTime animals, you may have noticed that something that's never come up is any kind of discussion of economy.
A very classic pattern, yeah, absolutely,
Yeah. So, based on what you know about how we've been setting up the LangTime kind of universe, and knowing that they started with nothing, essentially, kind of built up a society, what do you think we should be considering in terms of how the kind of economy they might develop? Like, what state would it be in? How would it function? Things like that.
Ooh, well, that's a tough question, because firstly it assumes that I pay more attention to the show than I do. So I mean, I'm not sure that I know all that. But also, like, this is made extra complicated because of the fact that we're dealing with animals, right?
Yes.
And so I think this partially depends really on a prior, sort of decision making about, like, how do they use their hands, and or whatever passes for hands, right? How do they use their bodies? What is it with their food requirements? Have they like increased, to a more human level, or are they still at the animal level?
That's
These
another
are, like,
interesting question,
right? I mean, you
stuff,
have to think, like, basically the way to think about any economy fundamentally is the production and distribution of resources, and a system for doing that reproduces a society in the way that it is, right? So it's a thing that keeps a system that through goods keeps a society going, because it needs people or humanoid or animals or whatever. they need things to live on, and they have needs, and we fulfill these needs with stuff. And so first you have to essentially know from your own setting or what you're coming up with what these needs are. Well, you know how this. So this is kind of like a back and forth thing where you think about, okay, what do these animals eat? What do they wear clothing? Like, right? How do they transport themselves around? What are their sort of culturally given needs? These kind of things. And then you think about like, okay, well, where do they get those things from? Given their landscape, given their technology level, and also like who does the producing, how is that set up? Who are the people who produce? Who are the people who get the stuff? What determines that? These are essentially the core economic questions that you ask about any setting, about any kind of like anything that's not so alien that it's like unrelated to human type society.
Yeah, these are a lot of questions that are really important that I've not engaged with at all.
Exactly.
Yeah, so...
I think that's...
I ran out of room for the yes. I didn't plan.
And now...
But here, maybe do that.
Now we know what Jesse has been up to.
Yeah, you can sort of...
Can you tell me if it's in frame?
You have to... That's
That's in frame.
Okay, that's good.
Oh, down. Yeah, did you bring it down from when I first said? Okay, good.
Yeah, that's good.
Okay.
Fantastic. There you go.
But yeah, I mean, in general, like when we're talking about the economy and world building, I think part of the problem that a lot of people have, which is why they don't tend to get into the economic stuff, is because firstly, it sounds really boring. And secondly, people think about the economy or economic stuff, and they think firstly it's very abstract, it's very vague, and they think about it like, oh, this is a bunch of math stuff, right? And nobody likes math except Miles, but okay, that's fine.
I do.
It's ridiculous.
Anyway, go on.
Anyway, the point being, nobody likes math. This is the important part. But for me, I mean, just speaking also personally, why was I interested in economic history is because underneath like the sort of boring looking stuff about like grain prices in medieval China or things like this is really a set of very human questions, right? Because firstly, what distinguishes societies from each other is for a large part how they organize their production and their distribution of resources. The system, the institutions that they have play an enormous role in what makes one society different from another. So that there's a very sort of human, cultural, social aspect to this. And the second thing that I think is very interesting, and now we're getting more into the kind of the world building, the storytelling type stuff, with any kind of division of labor that's beyond, the most primitive, the most hard scrabble survival, you get the fact that people depend on each other for these kind of resources that they need, whether those are immediate biological needs or culturally given needs. And this creates an opposition of interests, right? So this is why we talk about political economy. So you have an economic system which is about, how resources go around. But you also have the fact that there is always a system of interest where people are, if they get something from someone else, they have an interest in that staying that way. And if someone else gets less, they have an interest in getting more, and so forth. So there's always an inherent sort of set of conflicts of interest. And as we all know, the heart of any kind of storytelling is conflict, right? And the heart of human dynamics is in some sense conflict. I mean, this is what the vulgar Marxist phrase about class struggle means, is like this idea of like this opposition of interest is a really strong dynamic force. And it's one of the things that makes a society not just static, but dynamic, that induces change and it induces conflict. And it gives you a lot of stuff to think about. And so I think this is one of the things where it's quite easy to like set up a setting in a sort of, or a society in a world building sort of sense and be like, okay, these people live here, they live in the jungle, they have this religion, they have this kind of culture, and it's sort of like, they think this thing and they do this stuff. And that's cool, but like, and then you have to think about like, okay, but where is the conflict in the society and how does it change? How did it get there and how does it change? And this changes in two ways, either in the political way because people fight over these interests, and some people gain, other people lose. And the other thing is technological change, because technological change is very induced by economic incentives, by people being interested in finding new ways of making production easier, making trade easier, goods that come from somewhere else they want to go and get. This is how you get colonialism and all this kind of stuff. So there's a lot of stuff there that actually gives you a lot of dynamic material that you can think about for your setting, for your society, whatever it is. And that also gives you material for like bringing conflict and bringing kind of like dynamic aspects into your society. And I think that for me is really like the human story of what is interesting about economic things, is this kind of like, how does this work itself out?
So there are two things, I could offer you two bits, like two answers to this that I have thought of, but I think that there are more things that I have not. So I'll tell you what I have thought of, and then tell you what I haven't. So first, the thing that was going to end up introducing the big conflict into like the board game, and the reason that the animals are fighting is because this substance that essentially mutated them, like the TMNT ooze, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was there a long time ago, and that's how they got going, and it disappeared, and now it is back. And the question is, what is to be done about it? And it's reemerged, incidentally, right around where the rabbits live. And the rabbits kind of live in the middle of everybody else. The rabbits are not as technologically advanced by choice. They have a very kind of free and independent society. They like it that way, and they would prefer that others not impinge upon their, their way of life and their area. But now they are. So that was one thing that was going to be the main source of conflict. The other is that, well, there are two other things. One, because I haven't even introduced this aspect, but this game, I know many of you played it, and like the main way that you played it's supposed to be a multiplayer game where you battle each other, but I also imagined a one-player version or a cooperative version where essentially, and I know this is where I'm glad Biblaridian is not watching, but essentially the same thing that imbued the mammals, the small mammals, with uprightedness and fingers and thumbs and speech and all that, have made the insects larger and more aggressive, and so they
there's
now
a sort of alien outsider enemy thing going on.
Yeah, they represent a threat that they didn't previously. So there was that.
Like in Factorio or something. They're like,
In what?
never mind. It's
Okay.
a computer game reference.
It's one I don't know, evidently. And then the other thing was the mice in general. Like, we have a lot of fun with mice, and I know that they're just absolutely darling. But at least
I was going to say, you looked at me when you said we have these mice, and then you're like, I'm about to say something bad about the mice, and he's like
Essentially.
prepping me for it. I
prepping you.
sense it. I sense it.
not all the mice, but there are certain
Hashtag not all mice.
certain segment of the mice that are the type of kind of like scientists where it's like, let's not ask the question of whether this is a good area of progress. Let's just do it because of course it can be done, and so it must be done. And so that's where things kind of get out of control.
You are looking at me
mice.
like you're scared of me.
There are still very darling mice there.
But I mean, this raises an interesting question, for example, right? So
Yeah.
you have this setup now where like you have one society that like is doing a lot of technological advancement and
Yes.
other ones are not.
Yeah.
Right? So immediately the first thing that then comes to mind is like, wouldn't the other societies be interested in buying this or acquiring this technology from
The answer
them?
is yes.
Right?
Yeah.
So this is the thing, like, because whenever you have these kind of differences in whether in goods or in like technology or other things, there's going to be an opportunity for arbitrage, right? Somebody is going to want to bring it from one place to the next. That's how you get long distance trade and so on. And this is something that
Yeah.
would come to mind.
And this part I actually did think about a little bit. So essentially, it's like both the dogs and the opossums are very interested in this. Rabbits, very much not so. And then the cats, they're kind of like, they want to believe that whatever is going on, what they're doing is inherently better, even if it's not necessarily better. And so it's kind of like a conflict of them trying to realize, you know what, we're not necessarily as powerful as we think we are, but those who are higher up want to believe that they are. All right, and so that's where this kind of mouse-cat conflict lies, and of course, like the mice realize that there is potential, of course, with magic, which is of course the big deal for the cats, and so they're like, well, of course we're going to experiment with this and try to get better. The cats are still trying to say, you know what, no, magic is superior. We don't need to bother with all of this technology stuff, right? While still being quite aggressive. And then, of course, this would be what the leadership would be. There should definitely be cats who disagree. And that's, by the way, one of the things in the expansion, because cats get engineers. because they're trying essentially to learn whatever, the higher ups think, because they see themselves kind of slipping behind.
I have an interesting point to this, actually,
Okay.
because you mentioned magic. And
Yeah.
this is something where I've often thought about, because it's actually one of the reasons why, especially for myself, at least in my own world building and my own projects and stuff, in recent years I got more and more interested in not having magic in my settings. Because one of the, magic is cool, obviously, and there's a lot of different ways of doing magic, and you have, Brandon Sanderson, the rules about magic, all this kind of stuff. It's all good and well. But the big problem that always arises with magic is that it completely messes up any economic logic, right? It completely messes up any sense that your economic structure has, and this becomes really evident. I mean, the sort of obvious place to look for this is in like Dungeons and Dragons, right? So you have all this magic stuff, and then you have like a list because the player's handbook or whatever says so of like, okay, here's all these goods and this is what they cost, right? It's like, oh, it's 20 gold pieces for a halberd or whatever. But like there is no sense in which these two things are integrated, right? Because the thing with magic, at least in this sense, is that you create something from nothing. So you have essentially free energy, right, of some kind. And at the moment that you have that, the immediate question is like, okay, it's like having a perpetuum mobile. Like you have a sort of economic problem because at some point there is some kind of aspect of the system where something appears for free. And so you have to then think about like, okay, what is the effect of that on the relative prices of everything else?
Yeah.
Right? I mean, wouldn't everybody just want to have like magic and produce all their stuff through magic? And then, if they can't do that, why is it that they can't do that? And also, like, doesn't everything essentially lose its value because, if you can make anything indefinitely, to any indefinite degree, then obviously the price of everything tends to zero.
Yeah.
Right? And so introducing magic into your system is something that inherently has enormous economic consequences that are very easy to overlook and that are very hard to manage in a realistic way. It slips out of your grasp super easily. Or what you have to do, which is what effectively most settings end up doing, is sort of arbitrarily bracketing the magic. It's sort of here only for the purposes of casting fireball, and you can create food and drink like you can do with a low-level spell in D&D, but you only really use that in the dungeon. And we still have feudalism and, peasants and all this stuff. But that, of course, if you really think about it from a world-building point of view, makes no sense. Why even bother having any of that?
Yeah.
So that is actually for me, because I'm quite interested in having the sort of logic and structure of these human social systems. I mean, this is also why I ended up doing an anthropological aspect of this stuff. For me, that actually makes it sort of like less interesting in the long run, if you see what I mean. Even though magic itself is cool, it sort of undermines a lot of stuff, including this potential for human conflict or humanoid conflict, by having this kind of like hand-wavy element.
You kind of, you really have to. You really have to put some arbitrary limits on it. Either, basically, you have to fabricate either a cost or limit the benefit. And so
or even the availability of it, right? It's like one of
Yes.
the classic things. There are only very few wizards or something. It's like,
yeah. So like one thing that you could do is just anything that you create has a very limited shelf life. Like in the case for this, board game, it's like relevant to that this thing can exist for a battle, but it couldn't exist till the next day. It's gone. And so that at least, takes care of that.
So a lot of the magic you have in the game doesn't even last, goes for a turn, and then you're done.
Yeah. But like, for example, one of the first thing I thought of as you were talking about this is there's a solid magic school spell that you can create a kind of a brick wall, which is, if you can do that, then bricks are free. Right.
Yeah.
And so what you have to do is like say, all right, this thing can exist for like 6 hours.
But then, the question immediately arises, why not just automate it then? Like, we just every 6 hours we have somebody make this stuff, right? I mean, we just basically make a machine equivalent of this process.
You could.
Because this is what people would end up doing, because you can still get stuff for free.
But then you couldn't build a house out of it.
I guess. I mean, it depends on how you would set it up, right? It's like
you'd have to find something that where it's like this thing, like a heavyweight, is useful for for a period of 6 hours or less. If there was something that it was useful for that, then yes, absolutely. Yeah. It's.
But again, then you have to think about like, okay, at what inflection point then does it become worth having,
right.
Using this as opposed to the sort of natural method, right? And then, I mean, it's not. I'm not saying it's impossible to resolve this kind of thing, but it's as you can, the more you think about it, the more obvious it becomes. It's really hard to really control those kind of implications if you want them to be consistent and sort of relevant. which is in part why somebody like Tolkien doesn't get into his economic stuff much, right? Because it's like that's not what he's interested in anyway, right? It's not. It wasn't really his sort of passion. It's not what drives the story for him. But it's also because there are sort of, because his idea of magic is anyway very undefined and very sort of like contextual, and is really a form of personal charisma as much as anything. But even then, it's like, how does this exactly work? Whereas I think, for example, what you can have, and this is something I've often thought about, you can have actually very interesting things, even with very cliche sort of post-Tolkienian fantasy stuff with dwarves and elves and whatever. You can take a lot of those tropes and things that are interesting. And if you actually take the magic, so to speak, out of it, they can actually become really interesting again. So I thought, for example, just to give a very practical example, you have your dwarves, right? And they live in the mountain, and they make crafts and weapons and this kind of stuff. You have everything in the sort of standard Tolkien way. And you have your like humans and your elves who live in the woods and this kind of thing. And then you think to yourself, like, okay, so these dwarves, they live in the mountains. Where does their food come from? Right? Because like you can't really grow the food inside the mountain particularly well for obvious reasons. Their food also doesn't tend to grow super well on and around a mountain. So this is a problem, right? So then you start thinking, okay, in that case, you can immediately imagine a sort of trading system in which, the humans and maybe also the elves, if they're sort of like hunter-gatherers or whatever, something like this, they provide food to the dwarves and in exchange for, crafts and jewelry and, weapons and, sort of worked goods as trading materials. So immediately you can see a way in which these two societies or multiple societies might interact with each other. And that just follows then from thinking in these economic terms. And then you immediately start thinking, well, okay, but if that's the case, then the dwarves are actually oddly vulnerable, right? Because they don't make their own food. They're dependent on outsiders for their food. So what if they, for example, get into a conflict with the elves, stereotypically, and the elves are like, okay, well, we're not only not selling you food anymore, but we're going to blockade your trade route, right? We're going to besiege you effectively, because you're stuck in that mountain with your whole society underground there, or whatever. Maybe you have stores, but that might not last. And so we're actually going to like interrupt this trade route and prevent you from getting food. And then that is, they put a lot of pressure on the dwarves in this way. And then, you could imagine other people, maybe among the humans or whatever, because this happens, the price effectively of getting food to the dwarves goes up a lot. So maybe some of the humans are like, they're going to try and maintain this trade route or like smuggle stuff in because there's a lot to be had for them in exchange for that, right? And so basically this whole story, you have a story in your head that essentially writes itself. Yeah. Right? You have a whole, whatever this is, this could be a D&D adventure, this could be like a fantasy story, this could be all sorts of stuff. And the story just writes itself because you're thinking in economic terms. And you don't need the magic, right? You have all the tropes, but precisely because you don't have the magic, you have the story. And that's what I like.
Yeah. And it's like as I was thinking about this, part of it's difficult because, we're trying to put this this animal society in an actual place. I mean, a post-human place, but like we know the actual location, which is, just kind of like I think it's northeast of Toronto. We've got a map for the rabbits area, and we need to figure out the other areas. And so then the question is,
right, and this whole area. That I remember. Yeah.
And so the question is, are there things where we can situate each of these animals where certain of them are going to have access to things that the others will not? To kind of force cooperation. And then to,
Generally, this is interesting, right? Because in human society, the long-distance trade, which is usually particularly in prestige and luxury goods, right? There tends to be local levels of trade in like your staples, whatever your local like foodstuffs are, whatever the local kind of given thing is. But then there's always been, or at least we have evidence of this, at least from the early Bronze Age, there has been long-distance trade in like luxury goods and things that come from afar and that are good for the prestige and whatever from especially upper layers of a given society. And this is an important thing that connects people, right? And it's not just about bringing the trade together, the goods that go along the trade route, but with that long distance trade comes also culture and ideas and technologies that spread in this way. Like you think about how Islam spread into Africa through these long distance trade routes, or like how Hinduism and Buddhism and Islam end up in Indonesia in sequence, right, through these trade routes. And so this idea of like, again, this is a form of arbitrage, bringing one thing to another place. But this is a very interesting thing if you have a setting where that you have multiple societies, is to think about what does each of them have, especially in terms of like higher end goods, that could be really interesting for another one. And then you can also start thinking about, okay, well, but who are the people who are doing the trading, right? Who makes the caravans? What kind of people are they? And how does that go back and forth? And immediately, again, you have a lot of like things that you can, enrich your setting with.
Yeah. By the way, that's one thing that I had imagined, as I know the idea of a Creole has been brought up a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about, it's like, we have all these different animal kingdoms, and what about the ones that don't want to be a part of any kingdom? And then they just kind of make their own little society,
I mean, one of the classic
with all the
things
different types of animals.
Yeah, one of the things that's classic things where you get this kind of thing is exactly like things like trading ports, right? And you have these kind of like city-states, or the sort of effectively city-states that act as like trading entrepôts for long-distance trade. I mean, in human history, this is a very major phenomenon, right, globally. So, and those are classically places where a lot of, ideas and people and so on meet from different cultures and societies. It's often thought that one of the reasons that sort of ancient Greek philosophy, the pre-Socratics, where sometimes I think this is untrue, of course, but in the sort of canonical Western view, are like the start of philosophy, quote unquote. But, one of the reasons why this arises at that time and at that place is because they're on the Ionian seaport, right, in Western Anatolia, and these are important, like, sort of trading connections between the Mediterranean on the one hand and the Mesopotamian societies on the other hand. And there's probably a lot of exchange going on, a lot of people from different places. And with that, you get a ferment and an exchange of ideas. And those kind of things are, I think, always very interesting for settings to have. These kind of like small, often not themselves very powerful, but kind of very useful kind of entrepot places. And that's sort of one thing you could use for that.
We gotta go back and look at the map. By the way, Jake raises a point. So for that type of a society with all the different animals, they would indeed have to find somebody of their own species to mate with if they wanted to.
Yeah, this is, obviously this depends on the specifics of your setting and how you imagine these things, right? With humans, it's a little easier because we can all interact with each other in that sense. But if you really have speciation of some kind, I think this is the same with the classic Tolkienian one, where it really depends on people's interpretation, like how much can you have half elves or whatever, right? These are like things that you would then have to think about. At least we, as knowing people about language, can avoid the D&D thing of doing like, there is Elvish, and no matter where the elves are born, they speak Elvish, or which is obviously a thing I hate in world building. At least we know to avoid that bit, but the biological aspect is definitely something that still comes up.
Yeah, one of the fun things is that like
just have a bunch of pervert animals. That's me.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, let's just be clear. Of course, there will be pervert animals, but it just won't necessarily lead to procreation.
A lot of perversions don't. I can tell you that. Despite trying very hard, it doesn't work.
That's all right. It's really
it's still trying though, aren't you?
I know. You just have to keep going at it. Eventually,
it is about recreation, not procreation. That is my philosophy. Anyway, but what was I thinking about? Right. I had imagined that in terms of like at least in terms of the animal classes, like, what types that you had, there would be this kind of cultural exchange where, like especially like certain types of magic had homes in different areas. And so like the type of magic users that the cats are, I actually had a specific story where there was this there was essentially one rabbit who was really enamored of kind of cat society, and so went to live there.
That's always good, yeah.
And then their younger sibling wanted to be like them, and so learned, that type of magic is very low level. In the expansion, the sibling comes back. That's the
new Star Wars episode. The sibling comes back. Actually, speaking of this,
Star Wars would be the sibling returns.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
No, the return of the sibling. There we go. Anyway, sorry.
Actually, interesting point also what Jonathan mentions here. Like, I love Star Trek, but I can't stand to think about its world building for more than 20 seconds at a time. And I think this is actually a nice illustration in a way of what I'm talking about, because even though Star Trek doesn't have magic, of course they effectively do have magic, right, with replicators. And you see, in fact, in Star Trek how this gets out of their control, right? Because the Federation is meant to not have money because they have replicators, and so everything is resource free in some sense. But they do actually also have money because people are paying at like the bar in Deep Space Nine, right? And there is mention of money, and the Ferengi are really interested in accumulating money. And then the question is like, okay, that's good for the purposes of like simple episodes or whatever. But when you really think about it, like that makes no sense, right? It's like if you can just replicate whatever, then what is the purpose of this like monetary exchange? And if you have replicators, wouldn't everybody then want to have the replicators, right? The Ferengi should be interested in replicators, not in money.
Yeah.
And there's just a lot of like this kind of inconsistency, and like the replicator is essentially the equivalent of magic in that sense, where it causes this kind of like chain of effect to ripple through the whole setting that they cannot really control. And so then they have to just bracket it in some sense and only use it for like tea Earl Grey hot and then leave it at that, right?
So my theory is this. I won't speak about the original series. Star Trek The Next Generation is essentially a procedural mystery in a futuristic setting. And so what is interesting for the writers, like all that stuff is just details, because what they're telling is just mystery stories, and they do a really good job of it. Future series have engaged more seriously with these questions. And so this is why in Deep Space Nine, suddenly you do have this currency, the Press Latinum, which, by the way, apparently was introduced in The Next Generation. But that becomes a really big deal in Deep Space Nine, because they're like, let's make it so that there is some kind of currency and it actually means something in this universe and see what happens. And then you look at Voyager, and they did something very similar. They're like, well, let's push them so far away that they can't get the one thing that the replicators rely on, lithium crystals, and let's see what happens. And so suddenly you have something that you never had in previous Star Trek. You have a ship's cook who becomes a very important part. And getting food becomes something very important. And making dishes out of like completely alien things that they've never seen suddenly becomes very important. That was just completely unimportant.
Which also sort of shows the point that like it gets interesting because they remove the magic, right?
Yeah.
This kind of illustrates, I think, what I'm saying.
But I think it also shows why I became progressively less interested in Star Trek.
Thank you, Jay.
Because they got more interested in the world building and less, and just like because really all it is, they are either mysteries or morality plays.
Oh, totally. And of course, for Star Trek, this is also fine, right? Because that's not what you watch Star Trek for. It's for like the super rich and deep world building or whatever. Like this is not ultimately the point. This is scaffolding in order to do cool stuff with interesting actors and whatever, and suspense. I mean, that is all fine. But what I'm of course talking about is from the point of view of wanting to do world building, right? For whatever purpose, for whatever reason. Then I think this introduces a lot of problems that could be otherwise addressed, and removes again a lot of like tension that is actually potentially interesting. So
there is something that's very interesting about a lot of Star Trek technologies that I thought was very realistic, which is that one thing that keeps coming up with these replicators, you think like, well, you have a replicator, you can get anything. And that's true to an extent. However, there's often comments that, especially with food and drink, it's not as good.
That's right.
As the original.
It's just like they already have that from the beginning, that they kind of like set that up.
Yeah, and it's like, if you think about it now, like in terms of just small trinkets, right? Mm-hmm. Well, we have 3D printers, so why doesn't everybody just have a 3D printer and then they can get whatever you want? It's like yeah, you can, but it's like it's not necessarily as good as.
I mean, there's also other constraints, right? I mean, time is a major constraint. If the 3D printer is like 50 years how much faster,
the skill of actually finding the exact,
getting the models and so forth,
and that I think is quite realistic. It's like, all right, it's pretty good, but it's not exactly the same.
Well, and which also then creates an interesting thing, right? Because it means essentially that the real stuff, the natural stuff, becomes essentially luxury good, right?
Yep.
And that creates very interesting things. It's a little bit like how if I remember correctly, in the Blade Runner setting, there was no animals left, right? And so one of the tropes is the fact that like real animals are like extremely valuable, like super prestigious things to have.
Yeah.
Because they are almost all wiped out and so forth. And those are kind of fun things that you can then play with, because again, it sets up this kind of economic tension that is inherent in having an economic system.
Yeah. Incidentally, there's that same dichotomy with the holodeck. This difference between because it's like, I mean, really, if a holodeck existed, goodness gracious, it would just be banging 24/7.
Of course, which in fairness, in Deep Space Nine, they sort of acknowledged to some extent, right?
Yeah.
In TNG, they tried to like pretend that was not the case, but
yeah. All right. So I think we've solved enough problems to earn ourselves a treat. What I call it, Matthijs' favorite trait, as it is.
Well, I was actually going to see if Matthijs wanted to raid the cupboard for something that would be more interesting.
No, this is appropriate. We have to have a copy code. This is
Well, no, I mean, we
We
too
do.
can.
We
the
do,
question
but-
is, do you
we've
do you
got other
want to
things.
force yourself?
Yeah, I'll have one. I'll have one.
I mean, you certainly can, but what are your favorite types of sweets? And we obviously don't have any licorice here.
Yeah,
For
definitely,
obvious
it's like
reasons.
very salt licorice is one of my favorites.
I wonder if your
I like-
parents still have that jar that we gave them. They could run it over right
true.
now.
Very dark
Ooh,
chocolate I
sorry.
like a lot. Like if it's
Oh.
like high cocoa content, I enjoy that.
We have dark chocolate.
And occasionally I'm in the mood for like general sweet stuff. Like, but I don't tend to eat like candy bars or like sweet candy or things like that all that often.
Yeah.
It's not something I usually do. And as you know, I don't
No, I
like
get
ice
that.
cream and stuff like that. So.
Yeah.
Also, I'm really having trouble opening this freaking.
See, it's a little harder than it looks,
Than it
huh?
looks. It really is.
I
This
feel
is
like I lost some of mine. Look at those.
Yeah, yours is a little
All for one?
skinny.
Cheers. Copico, when you can't think of a darn slogan to say.
This is just not bad. It takes your breath away. Delicious coffee flavor. I love it. Super into it. So tasty.
This is actually a serious question and a potential avenue of product exploration. What if there was a hard candy version of Monster?
Oh, I mean, Monster's disgusting. It's not like I drink it because it's tasty.
Yeah, but if there was, you would have that hard candy.
Possibly. I mean, I tend to like drink soda, and horrible sweet stuff way more in drink form than I do in food form, actually.
Oh.
That's sort of one of my vices is consuming really terrible soda stuff. So I don't know about that. Also, like, yeah, the Monster Energy is a little bit there for energy, and partially it's there out of sheer masochism because it's disgusting, and yet I must have it. Just how it is. How it is with many things in my life.
Can you put the same energy boosting ingredients into a hard candy that go into the Monster? Like, would they survive?
That's something to ask Miles. I mean, that's a chemistry question, right? I don't know.
Is Miles a chemistry? Miles apparently likes Red Bull. Oh.
Red Bull is absolutely disgusting also. Actually,
Yeah.
almost all the energy drinks are
They really,
horrible.
yeah.
It's annoying though because here in America they don't seem to have what is my favorite Monster, which is the Monster Mule, which has ginger flavor.
Interesting.
And a really cool design on the packaging as well. And it's actually the only one where I can say that the taste is sort of a reason to drink it.
Miles, can you take something like a Monster energy drink or a Red Bull, turn it into a hard candy, and have it retain the same energy boosting ingredients? Maybe not in the same proportion, as you'd get in a whole can. But like, would it carry over the way that like you do get caffeine in small amounts in like a hard coffee candy, correct? Mm-hmm. Like there's caffeine in there. Yeah.
Do we?
Yeah.
There's caffeine in this one. Just gets worse and worse. Anyway,
We can break out the Dutch coffee candy that his parents brought back from the Netherlands
Yeah.
that you said really only grandparents eat.
Oh, the what's it called now? Hopjes. Mm-hmm. There we go. Yeah,
We
yeah.
got them.
I had like
Little taste of home.
until you showed me that. I had not thought about hopjes in like 20 years or something. Like, completely forgot that existed. I hated it as a kid as well. So, but my grandparents did have it.
And we wait for Miles to respond.
Yeah. In the meantime, we need to continue our discussion, I suppose.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I have to say, I really appreciate kind of being asked to think about these things since I don't. But it's like,
Yeah, and that's the thing. Like most people, sort of when they're, like I said, it's like very, in a way, easy. I mean, I don't say this in a mocking way, but it's sort of like it's quite standard to set up your kind of, your setting with like, especially for us when we were doing conlang. Of course, you have the language side, and then you have your like culture, and it's basically like, okay, there's a landscape, right, and there's like some cultural tropes. there's like maybe a religious thing or like something like this. And then, but you sort of start, as it were, from the back end. Whereas, in a sort of vulgar Marxist sense, like you have your base and you have your superstructure. Of course, not as simple as that, but it does actually make sense to start thinking about like, okay, well, what do they eat, what do they wear, what are the materials and so on that they use, and who produces those, and who decides who gets them, and then when you start from that point, actually the world building sort of works outward. Right, and so you have a lot less sort of this kind of retconning and like sort of engineering problems with your world building if you're actually willing to start in this kind of nitty gritty way. And again, like a lot of people find this kind of thing sort of conceptually boring, but again, I think if you think about the kind of implications for conflict, for like social stratification, for all the kind of things that and the kind of storytelling possibilities that come with that, it's actually not that boring.
Well, part of the problem here is less economics and more geographic, because like something else that's very useful, like if you think about, for example, your example of Tolkien's dwarves, Tolkien's elves, you're right. Dwarves live in the mountains, and we know what that kind of geography is like. Elves live, in the forest,
in the woods, some kind of woods, right?
And that's really cool because they're two radically different areas. Mm-hmm. These animals are not going to be in a very huge geographic area. I think that they're going to likely have a lot of access to the same things,
but they're not going to have the same drive to take the energy to work with the same materials. So like
that's true.
The rabbits in my head are the food growers, if for no other reason than they want to stay more connected with nature.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I think other societies like the mice are going to be like, we don't have time for this stupid gardening stuff.
And certainly not the cats. They wouldn't dirty their paws.
Exactly. So like just give us the food and
but one thing to think about,
we'll do something else.
One thing to think about in these terms is even if we sort of take these tropes as like applying to a whole society, which is of course always a little of a risky thing to do. But even if you do that, then you might think about like, well, okay, what are the implications then of these kind of things for the type of political and social stratification, the kind of class formation and so on in these societies? Like if you have like a much more agricultural society, you can think about like, does it look like manorial feudalism, or is it, is there some kind of tributary system? Do they have land taxes? How does that aspect work, and sort of like who rules them, and how is the land distributed? Do they hold it in common? Is it private? Those are major decisions to make about like how a society is organized. And the same with the other guys. Like if they don't want to do it, then they have to have something that they can trade with the rabbits, right? They have to have something that they have to offer. How do they get their stuff? And also like who controls that? These are still questions that would still arise in that way. And I think one thing to avoid in general, I mean, this work depends a little bit on what your purpose is and how realistic and so on you want to make everything. But in general, like one of the things again that makes the economic side so interesting is this conflict of interest aspect that exists in every society that has a sufficiently advanced division of labor. And so you cannot just in that sense have a society where everybody says like, oh, we decide we're not interested in this, we only do this or whatever, because you have to think about like, okay, in whose benefit is that within that society, and who is disadvantaged by it? Mm-hmm. And the people who are disadvantaged by it are probably wanting to change it, and the people who are advantaged by it are going to create systems to defend it. Mm-hmm. Right? And so you have contradictions in every society. You have a contradiction because of a conflict of interest over how stuff is distributed. And so those are things that then force you to think about, okay, what are the different, opinions or ideologies or whatever that arise within that society, within any given one.
And that's something I've thought a lot more about for I guess everybody except the opossums. The opossums are a little bit of a mystery. But with the rabbits, I see that as largely kind of a generational thing, because essentially the young people see things that are going on around them and are like, why aren't we responding to this?
That's often the case, right? That the youth will bring in the new sort of impetus and so on.
And then the mouse societies just, I just acknowledge it's insupportable, but I just love the idea of essentially all the mice having essentially every idea and thinking, let's do all of them. Let's throw every single governmental system, economic system, artistic system, everything. We're just going to do it all. So if somebody has the idea, they're doing it.
They're sort of like an anarchist society in the kind of way that should work or not work. Right?
Yeah. And then
Which is an interesting concept. I mean, you could do something Le Guin-esque sort of with that, right? Where you have this kind of...
tell me, don't know what it means.
Oh, Ursula Le Guin is one of the best fantasy sci-fi writers ever.
I know who she is, but like,
well, what I mean is like because she specialized so much in writing this kind of anthropological fiction, right, where she explores the kind of again, like avoiding usually magic, but rather exploring the consequence of like what if we had a sort of very different society to our Western one, you know, that was sort of anthropologically very differently organized, because she was a daughter of like Kroeber, the famous anthropologist, right? And then to think about like what sort of social conflicts, what kind of like ideas, you know, what kind of ways of organizing can exist in a society where you just start from the premise that they do things super differently. And especially what she really liked is to think about like how can you have fairly anarchic or very egalitarian societies, you know, sort of like tribal primitive societies, you know, but in the sense of like actually having a limited division of labor and being relatively egalitarian, not very stratified, not at all modern technologically. And how could you still have like meaningful conflict, meaningful change, and so forth in these kind of societies? And several of her novels and a lot of her short stories are about exploring these kind of themes about like how change and dynamism and like, you know, just normal human social conflict arises even in that type of society, and how you can explore that.
oh, that's cool.
Yeah, I really like her work for that reason, because she really pays attention to these things and really thinks or used to, you know, thought a lot about how that would exist and how that would work. One of my favorite novels by her is it's actually a sort of collection of long short stories, again, almost novellas, I suppose, which is called Always Coming Home, and it's set in California, I believe. I think it's set in like one of the valleys here. I can't remember if it's Napa Valley or one of the other ones. I think it's Napa Valley. But it's sort of in this long post-apocalyptic future in which these people are essentially living a sort of like, I guess, quasi Native American kind of technology level, but sort of in the ruins of like the old society. And it just sort of explores how like, you know, societies like that, about whose history, of course, we know relatively little, but like how those kind of societies might work and what the kind of conflicts might be and so forth. And it's kind of interesting also because the stories are kind of told in this kind of almost oral narration kind of style, where it's also deliberately kind of slow and not really about, you know, the sort of typical conflict that you have in fantasy or sci-fi. It's very not tense, but rather sort of languid, and kind of explores just sort of like how people live a certain kind of lifestyle, living a certain kind of environment. I find that very interesting.
That's really nice. Also, incidentally, for would-be authors where some conlayer is eventually going to have to do something with your work, that's a lot better than the society is very mysterious and we know very little about them. Like,
There's a little bit of conlanging in her book as well, and not very much, but there's a bit in there.
Yeah, I would be surprised if there wasn't anything, you know, in her work somewhere, given, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Though, of course, was it her father that destroyed the linguistics department at Berkeley? I think it was.
Could be, yeah.
Because like
Alfred Kroeber was her.
Yeah. Because we had Berkeley had the oldest linguistics department in America until, I'm pretty sure it was Kroeber. Kroeber decided, actually, no, this should just be a part of anthropology, and so he closed it.
Yeah, because I mean, what they were doing, like he and Worf and a bunch of the other people were doing the kind of linguistic anthropology of like native societies primarily, right? This is actually their real life project at that time. So I guess probably driven by that. Yeah.
I have never seen Kayla Gwynn done as Ursula
KLG,
KLG.
Notorious rapper Ursula KLG.
Yeah.
By the way, Miles said that theoretically, yes, it should be possible to reduce drinks like Monster into hard candies.
Glucose or whatever to balance the caffeine out, yeah.
But it would not taste good.
Well, I mean,
it doesn't taste good.
Yeah, it doesn't taste good to begin with.
Perfectly fine.
Oh, ran out of characters. Yeah, fair.
Star Trek Lower Decks explicitly acknowledged the holodecks are for banging. Oh yeah, to be fair, I haven't watched any of the recent series yet. I might do, but I haven't.
Yeah. Then, so I want to say two things about this. One, I misread Logan's messages. I'm now 13 minutes ahead, and I was like, oh, what are we going to discuss?
Give us a little roadmap.
Yeah. But
Spoiler alert. Yeah.
the idea for Star Trek Lower Decks was something that I had a long time ago, certainly inspired by Space Quest, which was an old video game, which was certainly inspired by Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But I always thought that would have been a brilliant thing. It's like, what if there was a Star Trek series that talked about the people that weren't the bridge crew,
Right,
And
exactly.
it was
Which
just
I think if you see TNG, this automatically this question already arises in you, right? Because
Yeah.
there's all this reference to background stuff going on, but you never really interact with these people except when they get killed,
yeah.
right? So
Yeah, and so like I'm really glad that the show exists, and I would love
Good
to
one, Jake.
I would love to see it one day. But yeah, that's another thing I really like, because it's like it's always the question of like what's the purpose of the show, like what's the ultimate purpose. And so something like Star Trek Lower Decks, it's about being funny. So like if you're enjoying yourself, if you're laughing, then it's succeeding, And so then it's like, well, how do we just use the world building, as a vehicle towards this end? And
yeah,
that,
that's
I
also
think-
fair, right? I mean,
Yeah.
when it comes to like, I rant about this economic stuff in part because it is something that interests me, and also because I think people underestimate its potential to be interesting.
Sure, no, yeah.
But it doesn't mean that, of course, you have to make that like a central focus of what you're doing. It really does also depend on what your priorities are and so.
And it's really, I think it's something that you need to state ahead of time. Like, what is essentially, like, what's the level of realism for this? What counts?
Yes.
What's going to count as part of the fun, and what is not?
Totally.
And it's like something that I saw that there was this Tumblr post that went around, and it was like, I hate all these, the anthropomorphic animal societies that don't acknowledge the animal diets. I like the ones where it's like, yeah, we still like to eat other animals even though they talk. I don't enjoy that at all. I don't enjoy that at all. I don't want to think about the cats actually like eating the mice. I don't care if it's realistic. These are walking and talking animals. You have to decide where you're going to draw the line. And the place, frankly, I am drawing the line there. I'm saying, you know what? Part of what changed them is this changed their diet. And if you don't like it, leave. I don't care.
Well, this is
Don't
funny
care.
in Redwall, right? Because of the inconsistency there, which is just like some of the animals. I mean, besides that, Redwall has like inherently good and evil things, animals, but also like some of the animals that are predators are like bad and scary because they're big predators. But then also like the scale of the animals is very unclear. And then at the same time, they like some of the animals eat meat, right? But that meat is like, it's usually fish, I think, and that doesn't somehow count as like being an animal in the sense of like the living animals, right? That can talk and do stuff. And so
I think
it's
as
sort of
long as
very
you
back
define
and
it,
forth.
if you define it, then it works. I say.
Yeah, no, I think that's not a
It's-
criticism. But
If
it's
you
more
just
sort of fun.
say it. But by the way, there was Aaron was starting to read Redwall to Meridian. I think my only exposure was the television show. Like, I've never read the
I
books.
didn't know that there was a television show. I
yeah.
only know of the books, actually. I read them in Dutch.
It was a British television show. It was very kind of slower paced, very nice. It wasn't like, but like as you're reading like the first or so chapter, there's like this enemy's coming, and he's got like, tied to his chariot the heads of other rats and things like that. It's like,
yeah.
Maybe this is not for very young children.
Yeah, probably 8 and up or so, I would guess, something like this.
Yeah.
I think it's middle grade, what they would say nowadays.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I will say that like even though like I'm a sucker for procedural mysteries, so I thought Zootopia was a lot of fun, but that one is really weird because they openly acknowledge that in this animal society, absolutely these animals did used to eat other animals, but now they don't by choice. For me, that's weirder.
Yeah, right.
For
They're
me,
just
that's
like,
weirder.
We just all became really ethical about this for some reason.
Yeah,
So-
and especially the.
although that again is mostly the setup for jokes, so that's also part of why they do it, I think.
That's true, but then there is kind of inherent embedded in the first story. There's this kind of racial metaphor which becomes very, very uncomfortable if you start
that's
teasing
the
it
whole
apart.
story, right?
It's like okay, but like these animals are actually really carnivores.
That's the thing,
What
right?
are you
Because they
saying
literally
about
are predators, right?
Yeah,
And this is
so
kind of like that's a little awkward, perhaps, not so well thought out. That's a very sort of like liberal take on this thing that didn't really pan out as well.
It didn't, and it's like I felt like it didn't need that.
No.
You know, like they could have just gone a different direction. And so it's just like, you know, if you say at the outset, you know what, these animals aren't eating each other, so deal with it. Not even going to talk about it.
Yeah, and some of the chat I think makes also a good point where you could say like, okay, well, you know, just like we have a taboo against cannibalism, which is almost universal, not completely, but large. You know, that they wouldn't eat the talking, you know, the sort of the sapient animals, but they might eat non-sapient animals. Like that makes some sense as a right as a rule does. Totally legit, I think.
By the way, so Jake mentions there of course is Antelope Shakira, yes,
There is
and there's
Shakira, which
a
is excellent.
wonderful song in that movie, Try Everything. But I had this weird language kind of blip in my head with this song because the part of leading up to the chorus, she has this line. Birds don't just fly, they fall down and get up. And the way I interpreted that, it would be kind of like saying, oh, you know, humans don't only walk, they also fall down and they also get up. These are three things that they do. And that was how I interpreted the song. I'm like, what a weird thing to say. Birds don't just fly, they fall down and get up. Like, why are you even saying this? I didn't realize that it was meant as birds don't simply start out flying. They go through these stages and then they get to flying. I was like, oh, that's what was meant. I just thought it was like, here are three things that birds do. It's like, why would you say this?
Well, TTYL, I mean, we know for a fact that humans fucked Neanderthals. I don't know if that implies that they would eat them, but they certainly interacted a lot with them.
And they were of course able to interbreed.
Yeah, because like, some of us have.
This is where. Oh, by the way, this is where Biblaridian wakes up after having been asleep for most of this. He's like, yeah. These species can actually interbreed and these can't, and here's the reasons why. I'm sure there's logic there.
Are you being rude to Bib?
No. Oh gosh, don't you dare even imply it. But like,
I'm just making sure. I didn't know.
Can rats and mice interbreed?
I don't know. That sounds like a question for our biologists out there.
Because like, no, yeah.
So like, horses and donkeys can interbreed, but then their offspring is infertile.
Right. Horses and zebras too, I believe.
I think you're right. Actually, I think you're right.
So,
I think you're right. But like rats and mice, they seem pretty close.
I don't know if they're genetically that close, but
also like common dogs and foxes. Yes.
I believe even wolves, but I'm not too sure. Also, I need Jessie to ask me a question because she has barely talked on the whole show. So I need you to engage with me.
Hi, Matthijs.
Hi.
Oh, I have been listening and enjoying and lost in my head of world building and thinking, how could I apply this? And which worlds do I even want to apply it to? Because sometimes you create languages and create just enough of a world to house it, and that's all you want to create. Because it's like there's never going to be any characters, there's never going to be any stories in the world. It's something to house my language because I just want to create a language.
Sure, I mean, yeah.
But there are some
Same
worlds.
I mean,
yeah, because it's just sort of like getting to the point of what you're doing the art for.
But I tend to find that then when I have done that, then I start wondering about this society, right?
Sure. And there are definitely things like, you know, things you're talking about, especially with like basic goods and like, well, where do they get, you know, clothing from or whatever. And so it's like there are definitely things like that you need to think through, even if you don't want a story-based con world kind of situation, just because it's like, well, what words would they have for clothes?
Right, exactly. I mean,
like, what would they make it out of?
For the vocab building, this can be really cool, right? Because a lot of stuff is also like words are, you know, applied based on very basic stuff that people interact with all the time, right? I mean, this is where your roots are. This is what other things are by analogy referring to, and so forth. And then you have to think about, well, what are those, right? Like, what's one of the things that I also do with the vocab building? I think like, what are the really basic materials of various kinds? You know, like thinking of minerals, thinking of plant materials, things like that. That like this society all the time interacts with. And those are
Right,
sort of
right.
like among the first roots that I will make for a language after I've made the word for owl, of course.
Oh, of course, of course.
This is the most important one. But, you know, those are also things where, like, directly into the conlang, this kind of stuff comes in. And it's like, I mean, you think about, for example, how in German, the word for cotton is Baumwoll, right? It's like tree wool.
You're right.
And
yeah.
that, like, you know, and that's a compound that you can only come up with when you think
Right.
about, like, what have they all the time interacted with, which is wool from sheep.
Right.
That is very basic, fundamental for them. And then later they are introduced to this stuff, and it's kind of fluffy and whatever, right? And so they're like, oh, you know, that's tree wool. And then you have a really cool word. Like, even at that level, this
Right.
can be really interesting.
And so then it's the matter of, can you really ever escape economics
Well, you
if you're
cannot,
trying
no.
to?
And I think this is part of, like, for me also what makes it interesting. Like, one of the things, I don't know about you guys, but, like, for me that is interesting, for example, with conlang, is when you think, for example, about sound changes, but also a little bit about how grammar works, is that you can get results that are surprising to you, right? You can get the results that you didn't sort of deliberately plan ahead of time, but it sort of comes out this way. You're like, hey, that's actually really cool, right? And one of the things I like about thinking about the economic side of things is that it has a similar possibility. It has a similar thing where you force yourself to start thinking about this stuff like, okay, well, what do they do? You know, where do they get this stuff? Like, what is that thing? And then you start thinking about it just by association or whatever, and you suddenly start coming up with a bunch of stuff that you didn't plan to come up with.
Right.
And then you start thinking like, hey, that's actually an interesting idea because it implies that they would have X, Y, Z or whatever, you know, or like they would be organized in such and so a way, or maybe they would have like this yearly trek to that place to get the thing, or you know, that sort of stuff. And like it gives a lot of potential there for like forcing yourself into that creative mode, right? I mean, this is the best kind of creativity, is where you set yourself some parameters, a problem that you need to solve, and then you come up with something that you didn't expect as a solution for that. And that's something I really like about it.
That actually is an idea because, again, like one of the biggest problems I had was like they're all in roughly the same area. They all have access to roughly the same things. And so now, again, luxury goods, that's a thing because there's always innovation in different societies. And so they can definitely come up with different things. And
Also
plenty of ideas for
value
that.
different things, right? Of
Yep.
course, yeah.
And also effort levels. So in other words, if they just prefer other people to do this and then buy it, then yeah, that's another thing. But the idea of a trek is also interesting because if you have these kind of super insects, suddenly travel becomes more difficult and more hazardous. And so suddenly something that was very easy to get is no longer easy to get. That is also
Almost always interesting, right? I
Yeah.
mean, it's sort of like, again, this principle of storytelling, like making something scarce or hard to get or sort of whatever, automatically creates a restriction, and restrictions are more creatively interesting than allowances.
Yes.
Right? Again, this is sort of why I rant about what the problems with magic are, is because it allows a lot of stuff, and what's often more interesting is not allowing a lot of stuff. And that forces you to think about, you know, how, just like people in real life have to think about how to come up with these solutions for that, it also forces you as a creator to come up with that.
Yeah. All right. Cool. This is honestly, this has given me a ton to think about,
Right?
which is going to be very useful as, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Magpie points out Sanderson's laws, and it's like, you know, I know about Sanderson's, even though I don't always like his books that much, I do like his engagement with these questions. I think is interesting. I don't
Yeah.
necessarily like his answer to the questions, but I think he asks good questions about it, certainly from this point of view.
This reminds me of, what was it? Ghost in the Shell, where it's like, wow, you really put a lot of research into this. I really am bored watching this.
Really, I love the Ghost in the Shell. I've watched it
Seriously?
many times, and also the sequel, the Ghost in the Shell 2. I think it's great.
Have you seen the shows?
The standalone complex. I think I have, but I don't remember anything about it, so maybe I haven't. I'm actually not sure. But definitely the two films I like a lot. Yeah. But I mean, honestly, I like them primarily as an aesthetic experience, not so much as a story per se. I don't think the story is necessarily super profound, but I think the aesthetic, the sort of interweaving, you know, or the way that it's kind of like with the Doom movies, right? Like the one that we just had. Like, you know, this is an aesthetic present. The story is a vehicle essentially for an aesthetic presentation, and for me, the Ghost in the Shell is a similar thing.
Yeah. Shoot, what was it? Oh man, I forgot. I was gonna say something. It's done. Let's talk about our dog Yodis.
Well, I have another
But
another thing from real life that could be brought up, which is when
Yes.
I'm talking about these long distance things
Oops.
and arbitrage and so on. It's like one of the things that's also a really important historical driver is, of course, the fact that when you have this arbitrage over long distance trade, people who are really interested in what their terms of trade are, and so that that eventually leads people to try and find ways to get around having to pay a lot for stuff. And in our human history, this is a driver for the Columbian Exchange. This is a driver for exploration into the Indies. This is a driver for Europeans who are actually who were for a long time on the sort of receiving end of a chain of trade from Asia, where they felt that their terms of trade were really bad because it goes through all these intermediaries, and all of those intermediaries add something to the price, and so
Yeah.
and so at some point they then really become interested in okay, but what if we go there and get it? Then then we don't have this problem anymore, and so they start exploring and start trying to find ways of getting there. Whether or not they have a very good idea where they're going, this, as we all know now, is a secondary thing. But that doesn't really matter, because the important thing is the fact that they're trying to go and get that. And this is a very nice way in which you can use economic incentives or kind of economic concept as a way of driving the notion within your world of people going to other places, which again is also, of course, a classic story trope, right? The Odyssey, the going
Yeah.
somewhere, and also because it allows you to connect different societies that are quite far apart from each other. You can start thinking about, well, what if people do go on this travel, right? They go all the way over there in order to get stuff, and what do they find along the way, and what kind of implications does that have for the both societies on both ends, and even this can be like it was in our history, a driver for people to to discover quote unquote places that they don't know about, and you can get these kind of encounters and so forth. I think there's also a lot of rich potential in there just by thinking about where stuff is coming from and where it's going.
No. So Patrick has already explained, because I was going to say, how could you just shamefully return after leaving and just kind of sheepishly announce yourself by just saying, Matthijs.
Yeah, temporarily back to Michelle, brother. To take me out to dinner.
Yeah.
Also, Bibluridian.
Thanks for the invite, Patrick.
Bibluridian was very happy to have claimed the word for Dobson fly into Papua. And that I had totally forgotten about that, and now that makes me happy all over
I
again.
don't know what a Dobson fly is, but it sounds nasty.
It's
I
named
remember
after
we had
Jeremiah Dobson.
Of course.
looked it up at the time.
Yeah.
There we go.
Hi, anime fan.
These big things.
Oh my. Oh my.
Oh, those look disgusting.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
so.
And
Impressively bad.
Yeah, that could be a definite
That's
awful
Bibluridians.
beastie. Incidentally, one place where more world building will be seen is, one of the things I had planned for the cooperative version was essentially that you would start off with these 1-star characters, and then you'd go through kind of a story set where there would be, an AI that works similarly to the way that enemies work in Gloomhaven. So in other words, as you move, there's a predictable way that the enemies move, and you move them, and you kind of go through a one or several player mini little RPG campaign.
Just sort of like Hero Quest, actually.
Yeah. Except that rather than one thing I really loved about Doomhaven is that with Hero Quest, if you're going to play it, essentially there's one person who is not playing.
Yeah, there's a GM essentially, right?
Yeah. And it has to work that way.
Yeah. True.
But
and Gloomhaven doesn't have that. I haven't played it.
Not at all. It's so cool. It's really ingenious the way it was planned. But yeah, everybody plays together, and essentially it's they have actually a similar card system to the way that my game works, except that it has extra stuff in there, movement and attacks. And so randomly it will show you what the enemies do based on what you do. And there's also rules, kind of like the way that threat works in MMORPGs, right? And so it's if you have
whether they aggro you or not.
If you have a character here and a character here, and the enemy is
People
here,
can't see that,
then right.
Did you just click on something when you did that, babe?
Oh, hang on a second.
Well, now you can't.
Wait.
Are you going to add as moderator? Like, I don't even know the difference.
Tell you.
Someone's being upgraded.
Bibleridian is now a managing moderator.
Does that change how, like, if Bibleridian comments now? Is
I
there
don't know.
gonna be
Bib,
something
say
special?
something. Yeah.
And also, TTYL is asking, is that the Matthijs from episode 101? And, like, you're the only Matthijs we've ever had.
I'm pretty sure I must.
Was that
yeah.
episode 101?
I mean, I am in episode 1 because I've watched the show from the beginning. So in that
Yeah.
sense,
Wow.
that is true.
So,
yeah.
yeah.
Ah, look at Bibleridian.
Oh my
Yeah,
God,
the little,
Bibleridian.
Yeah, you're fancy
The
now.
wrench.
You've
icon.
got a little bit of everything now. The
Yeah.
check mark, blue.
That's power. But yeah, let us take at least a small moment to acknowledge that Matthijs is one of the very, very few people who has been here from the beginning.
Yeah, I'm extremely OG, and that's also because like I was already watching your conlanging videos before that, right? The standalone ones.
What?
Oh, yeah, the art
Like,
of language invention.
art of language invention things that you did on YouTube.
I keep hearing that people like watch those.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and all I remember hearing at the beginning was people complaining, just saying, "LOL, these are really low budget," blah blah blah, and I was like, whatever.
Well, yeah, whatever. But I mean, the thing is, there was one, especially at that time, there was very little of this kind of like thematic, as it were, mid-level conlanging content out there. And you made this series of videos on that, and I watched that. And I do remember also thinking like, hey, wouldn't it be cool if people, if you could actually follow along with how people are making the conlang, because if you really, you can really learn something from seeing people do it in practice, right? People who know what they're doing. That's with any topic, anything on YouTube. And so I was like, that seems like such a cool idea. But then for a little while you did the glyph making, which is of course terribly boring and nobody watched it. So then I was like, okay, whatever, this is not happening or something. But then I saw that this show was going to do it. I was like, that is exactly what I've been looking for. So that's why I joined from the beginning.
And we are grateful that you hang on for the
pretty
last
sure I've been
quarter of every season where we do glyph making.
Yeah, which I like. I do other stuff in the background too.
Yeah.
It's like,
Also, but like even if you don't enjoy it as much, I mean, you weren't one of the ones who was really rude about it in like the first season.
No, not at all. And I mean, I may, I'm also in the chat now to like joke with our friends and so on, right? I mean, we have a community, and that aspect is really fun. So, but I'm pretty sure I've been a Patreon or a patron from the first episode.
Oh,
as
yeah.
well, yeah.
Oh, wow.
And so that is something that's really rare, and I mean, we're really, really grateful.
Well, thank you. Of course, in
Also,
exchange, I've now been on the show twice, so there you go.
Yeah.
You never know what happens.
yeah. Also, really grateful to. I mean, there was you, and there were I think like 2 or 3 other people that were really there from the beginning.
Yeah.
Also, very grateful to Bibleridian who brought people to our show, and I that kind of blew me away. It was like, wait a minute. Bibleridian is here and he's encouraging people to watch this? Why?
Yeah, no, but it's a big. I mean, those people have obviously like made a huge imprint themselves in like also with Edgar, like doing stuff in world building. And
He
so
was
on,
essentially the king of conlang.
yeah. I mean, and it's sort of interesting because again, that sort of stuff wasn't around, and then suddenly multiple people were doing it, and now more people are doing it, and now there's like a good amount of choice in this. But, at the time there wasn't anything other than, and then there was LTS. So I was like, that's where we go.
That was also, by the way, before I knew that I had met.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
That was before then. So he was still like Batman isn't the right comparison. Nightwing or the one on Teen Titans where Robin becomes, I think, Red X. That's the proper comparison, because it's like here comes this enemy that they've never heard of, who's like a real badass, and then they find out later, like, wait a minute, Robin, that's you? And it's like, yeah, that was the case. Yeah.
I was nervous when Bibleridian first showed up because I was like, oh my God, like, this big name is here.
Yeah, it means we actually have to.
I'm pretty sure I learned about Bib through here rather than the other way around.
Really?
I think so. Yeah.
Wow.
Also because it's primarily doing the speculative biology stuff, and that was never an area that I was super fascinated by.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, now that Biblaridian is actually here again, he can tell us which of our animals can interbreed successfully. Though I think that we hit it. Oh, something else. Okay, so we know that apparently rats and mice can't interbreed. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't think so, but
What about, so let's just throw in, because these aren't animals we've done yet, but they're, could be in there. Let's talk rats, mice, chipmunks, squirrels. Any of those. Can any of those interbreed?
sounds dubious. I mean, I really think that like not that many
Yeah,
different species actually interbreed, right? Unless they're very close to each
Yeah,
other.
they have to be super genetically
and like
close.
anatomically also, usefully compatible. So I don't think it's super common, that phenomenon. Of course, it's also like then, a question of where the species boundaries and so on. There's some arbitrariness to that, but
Yeah. I
3 cubic yards of landscape.
Oh, landscaping rock.
That's definitely something very different.
Okay,
Polly.
so
And that's
Yeah.
fine. No, I'm not. We're not trying to do that. It was just a genuine question. It was a genuine question. We didn't know, or at least I didn't know, like where the lines were. We found out that dogs and coyotes can breed.
So it seems to be a lot of the canines, for
Yeah.
whatever reason, are like I guess all so close to each other that they can do it.
Yeah, I mean, I know that Logan's very excited about getting these landscaping rocks delivered, but I swear these invasive rocks, I mean, that come from different regions, people don't give a thought to this. You put just like, it was like, oh, it's just decorative. Here's some invasive rocks. Suddenly there are rocks everywhere that are just not native to the region. Just disgusting, really.
because those can interbreed.
Yeah, I
At
know.
free will.
Especially, it's like, some of these rocks, they just breed with other rocks, and it's just take over,
It's everywhere, and then you get all these glaciers that push rocks on us. It's like it's just ridiculous. It's like, I mean, we really need to defend our borders against these glaciers because they're bringing rocks everywhere. Like they're taking our land.
That sounds very.
Oh man.
Different plant species. Yeah, that's true.
Oh,
I guess,
yeah,
I was thinking more in terms of like animals.
Yeah.
I guess that's for plants is more common. Yeah.
Oh man. Anyway,
With non-native
non-native
sand. Oh my god, that's amazing, Jake. Like, not amazing if it's an actual problem, but amazing in the sense of the context
This
here.
is why I vote for Nigel Farage to defend our native sand.
oh man. All right.
Actually, this does bring an interesting point.
Yeah.
Going back to economics, where about domestication as well, right? That's also an interesting thing when we talk about the interaction between economics and culture and world building. When you think about like what animals are, just plants, but also what animals are available to them, to a given people. Now we're just assuming like a humanoid type society, right? Like what animals are available to them, how do they domesticate them, how do they use them, and for traction, for like transport, for things like this. It's a very major factor in sort of economic development. Like thinking about a camel-based society like pastoralism and the kind of nomadism that comes with that, or do they have things like can they do horse riding? If you have horses, do you also get the wheels famously, etc., etc. Right? These are also like actually quite significant decisions to make.
I can see the mice deciding to try to domesticate large beetles.
The Dobson fly.
There's like horn beetle ones that they can like ride, like that would be cool.
Wait a minute. Biblaridian has a whole series planned to talk about domestication.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
I mean, like as long as alien biospheres? Wow.
I hope for Bib's sake that he never does anything as huge as that again. I mean, we're happy with it, but like that seemed to be quite a string.
We were worried about Biblaridian at the end.
But I mean, I'd be very interested.
and glad to see him in person after it was over, and he is still breathing. So
Right.
thank goodness.
But I would be really interested in domestication stuff because like the pure biology things don't interest me as much, but like this obviously intersects much more with the kind of economic and social stuff that I do care about, and history of technology things that I find very interesting.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's also tied in then back in with like what gets domesticated and what therefore becomes not food sources, right? So like in some cultures it's like you eat some kinds of animals because that's just expected, but in other cultures they treat and view them differently, and therefore they are sacred, and you don't treat them as food sources. And so I think it's all just so interconnected, and it's so much connected with very early decisions in a society that, modern times we don't have access to that anymore. And it's like, well, why did this one animal take this precedence over another?
And also the spread of them through things, right? I mean,
Yeah.
both rats and mice are eventually introduced into Europe from quite early on.
From like ships and things,
Yeah,
right?
exactly. From like ships and things, and of course, there's the famous effect of there's this great book, classic book by McNeill about the effect of diseases and spreading through Eurasia, right? And like the cycles of sort of social development in these areas, and that's also stuff you can think about. Or like we were joking about like native, rocks and whatever, but you can think about like the introduction of animals and the kind of effect that might have, and the way that like people can adopt these kind of things. There's a lot of potential there always, again, for thinking about interchange and interaction. And so, like, that's one, for me, really one of the virtues of, again, the economic aspect is that it introduces dynamic thing, right? I mean, we tend to think in culture and religious norms and things like that, and they always have this kind of static aspect, right? Like, this is what they believe, this is what they think, this is what they value. These are sort of like, you need those things, it's not a bad thing, but those are kind of like the static parameters in some way. And one of the things that makes the economic side so interesting is because it keeps this kind of dynamic aspect going, and that makes your society become much more alive.
And it also, I think, is interesting because as you're thinking about the dynamic shifts that happen with the, economy and everything, some of the shifts don't have to be maliciously oriented, like cutting off dwarves on purpose from food supply. It could also be, non-maliciously done, whereby, for instance, you find a better way of growing your plants, but it now has a chemical that harms the dwarves, and you didn't know this, but you sold them the food, and now suddenly their, numbers are starting to diminish, and they think you're trying to kill them off, and, your society didn't intend that to happen. So it's like you can also get these sort of an accidental introduction of the rat to a new country where it's like, I didn't know that was on the ship.
Or rabbits in Australia. And so, of course, a lot of the Colombian exchange is this, right? I mean, the larger part of like, the sort of genocide of native people is through disease, and probably intentional for the most part.
Yeah.
Not always, but mostly, right? But nonetheless, enormously impactful. It really contributes to the fall of empires and the rise of new types of society, and so that's a major thing for sure.
By the way, taking this back to a micro level, there's something that really interests me about, for example, Jesse's parents. And I think people like them because, from my perspective, I'm a very, very suburban person, And the idea of having this taboo with certain animals you don't eat is because, well, they're pets. They're nice, right? I find it very interesting that, Jesse's parents, they have these animals, and they really like these animals. Janet gives all of her chickens names, all of her roosters gives them names, and treats them very nice. But it's very matter of fact. It's like, oh yeah, and then when they get too old, they'll be dinner. And there just doesn't seem to be any. There's no taboo there.
For the roosters specifically.
Yeah, but there doesn't seem to be any taboo there at all.
By the way, when you did a hand gesture, you held up a thumbs up in front of my camera, thus giving the screen a thumbs up, and people were like, "What just happened?" So David, do a thumbs up in front of my camera again.
What?
Just hold your thumb up. No, not that close. Just like here. We got to wait for it to be in frame.
Oh.
Just hold it.
Yeah.
And then eventually it should pop up on screen.
Yeah, that's all right.
But
Maybe it didn't work this time. But he did that, and like it didn't work. Yeah, Miles noticed it. But it was like, I can't see in screen here. So
Anyway.
it'll work. Okay.
Sorry,
now it won't do it now that I'm trying to make it work. But that was what happened. Anyway.
That was what happened,
Yeah.
I mean, TTYL makes a good point here, where it's like this is very much a thing of like farmer culture, right? Also, the relationship to animals in kind of farming societies is very different from like in hunter-gatherer, foraging, or pastoral societies. And so these are, again, things where also like culture and sort of ideas and so on can be downstream from economic phenomena, because there's such like, there are almost these kind of archetypical models. I mean, you just have to read like the Old Testament or similar things to get this sense of like the conflict between pastoral societies and farming societies, which is very different ideological attitudes that they have. And you get similar things with these kind of like, this is one of the things that make economic anthropology interesting, where you get this kind of comparison of these kind of models or types of societies, and there are patterns in that. And it's very interesting, I think, to study those patterns and apply them to your own world building, to think about like, how if you have a sort of pastoral society, you think about how nomadic are they, and then, how do they relate to the urban life of like the farming societies, right, where urbanism arises and you get like cities and so forth, like the famous medieval Arabic writers that wrote about this cycle of like the outsider pastoralists that like raid the urban settlements and eventually conquer the urban settlements and then become the next urban dynasty themselves, right? And then it happens to them again and again. Then you get this kind of cyclical motion, like stuff like that. You can think still in terms of relatively simple tropes. You don't have to get too granular about it, but you can have very powerful concepts as part of your basic world building. Like that's something that I do when I make these cultures for my languages. I have like a biome for them. So I usually do like, okay, it's this kind of landscape, it has this kind of like Köppen climate, whatever thing. And then I do something like, okay, they have roughly this kind of model of economy, like, so they have like a sort of rice culture along a river, or they are like nomadic pastoralists, or they are like, pastoral society that's semi-nomadic and lives in high mountains, like Tibetan style, or, something like this, or they're like steppe raiders. You can have like a bunch of these simple models, and that already can give you a whole lot to work with, I think.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. It's really hard when my body feels like it's 60 and I look like I'm 20.
I know. Such a tragedy. You keep getting ID'd. Yeah, it's like.
Yeah.
Oh.
Anyway, so
was Miles calling you out? Big stretch?
There's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that.
No, I don't think the physical big stretch. I think the age was a big stretch.
There we go. But yeah, we're in our last few minutes here. So this is really your chance. Ask Matthijs any question.
And this is an easy one right off the bat. What's the best way to conlang?
Very carefully.
Wow, that was actually a really good answer.
It's my best friend Mika. She always does this. Whenever I want to know something from her, she will always first say very carefully. Incredibly annoying.
I gotta say, whatever works for you in the moment that you're doing it, and not to get stuck with, this is how I used to conlang, I need to keep doing whatever strategy I was doing. And I'm thinking more procedural, like sitting down in the morning and, working on 2 words a day or doing X whatever every day. If that's not working for you anymore, then you don't need to make it work. And I don't know, whatever works for you in the moment, whatever keeps you conlanging.
Yeah, for me, it's like I usually have an idea for like a feel of a language in my head, right? I'm sort of like, okay, it needs to sound roughly like this. It should be, so have some of the features that are characteristic of a bunch of different native, natural languages, or something like this. It needs to be in roughly this kind of sphere, as it were. Usually I deliberately, and then I try to often deliberately like not match those with their sort of cultural or social context that they have on Earth, right?
Yeah.
And so and then I sort of like try to pair these up, and then I always have also somehow in my head like a kind of natural environment, and like I said, a kind of economy or sort of model economy, a kind of archetype, a trope in my head that should be combined with this, and then I sort of smoosh the two together, and that's basically how I do.
But how do you feel about bilabial consonants, specifically approximants?
Did you happen to watch Let's Have a Booba yesterday?
I did not. I have not been watching anything.
You
I've
missed
been traveling a lot.
You missed nothing.
I guess we'll have to have a kiki about that then.
Yeah. But they were talking about adding these. Gosh, it was the beta with like the little T underneath it.
Yeah. I never do anything with those little T things.
Yeah.
I think that's a waste of time.
And then
also
there was
labials I learned generally about 4.
The V with the the little
Oh, with
dipsy
the
doodle on the
right,
end.
yeah.
I don't even know what the
Oh,
middle.
wow,
I don't
wow.
even know what the middle one was.
Okay.
It was just like I said what they should do is just delete the entire cell, and they were like, "Which one should we go with?"
Mia the feline asks, "How do you know the difference between my sound changes aren't right and I started with the wrong phonology?"
Oh, you can just send me a snapshot of the original phonology. It takes me seconds. Yeah.
This is a scalable idea. That's like this will never cause any problem.
I would like to cycle back to the beginning of this stream and just remind anyone who sends David anything to remember that sometimes he has a tone, as Jonathan says. And remember that if you send him anything to comment on, that sometimes he has a tone. And sometimes he's riffraff. Remember that too.
I feel like I'm getting tone policed here.
I'm just saying, like, if you send your
Is
work,
it
be
registered
ready.
tone?
Be ready for the feedback in whatever shape it comes in.
Yeah. All right. Well, we have to go because we have to show Matthijs at least a little bit of the coast.
Which is terrible because they're going to take a redhead to the beach. They're literally like, I'm like, what do you want to do? And then they're like, yeah, let's take you to the beach because you'll totally love that as a guy with
Yeah, it's
ultra pale skin and red hair.
Yeah, it's gonna make for an exciting.
Am I even
flight.
darker than you?
Oh yeah, of course you are. I'm
Like a tiny
quite a bit
smidge.
paler than you are. Yeah,
My goodness.
I am in California. That's right. Yeah,
That's right.
I'm at home here.
Yeah.
This is ultra suburbia here as well. It's absolutely disgusting.
Yeah, it is. Was this a genuine question, by the way? Are you in California? Because you know that Jesse and I are in California, and it's like this isn't like a weird
Physically here.
This is actually a new development in hologram chat, and it's been very realistic. So thank you.
I'm the
And
new
we'll
Alexa,
start
yeah.
fuzzing you out as we go.
I'm that AI sex doll thing from like Blade Runner 2.
There we go.
That's actually my goal, really.
All right. Well, we need to get going. Thank you, everyone, for being here. And thank you, Matthijs, for giving us an amazing discussion and giving all of us so much to think about. And till next week, everyone, stay grammar.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Okay. The stream has ended.